You step through a narrow, muddy lane, and the air hits you like a cold, damp blanket. The scent of smoke, wet straw, and let's just say, unwashed bodies wraps around you like a stubborn fog. You glance at the row of crooked homes, their thatched roofs sagging under the weight of years and rain, and immediately realize that comfort is a luxury nobody in this age can afford. You probably won't survive a day here unless you have an unusual fondness for fleas, rats, and the constant threat of accidental fires. But don't worry tonight, you're only a visitor. And even though you're safe on your couch or bed, it helps to imagine the chill, the smell, and the cramped space to truly appreciate how life once was. Inside one of these medieval homes, you notice the walls are made of wattle and daub, a mixture of sticks, mud, and straw. The craftsmanship is simple, practical, and, if you're being honest, a little frightening. Every gust of wind makes the walls creak, and a particularly heavy rainstorm can send small leaks dripping onto your head while you sleep. Scholars still argue whether these homes were ever truly sturdy, but your imagination fills in the rest nights spent shivering under thin blankets, while the animals huddle close, hoping to absorb any bit of human warmth. You wander deeper into the home, avoiding the patches of wet straw that stick to your shoes, and realize that this is a place where survival was a daily negotiation with the elements. There's a faint glow from the hearth in the corner, where a small fire struggles to keep warm the entire family, their livestock, and occasionally a neighbor who's been invited in for the night. The smoke curls lazily toward the ceiling, where it meets the blackened beams and lingers like a stubborn ghost. Oddly, this smoke also masks the less romantic odors of home life's spoiled food, unwashed humans, and the occasional whiff of mow inside from the yard. You can almost hear the tiny scurrying of rats and mice in the dark corners, a constant reminder that you're not alone. You probably didn't think medieval life involved this much survival. The floors, for instance, are nothing like the polished wood you're used to. Their bare dirt, hacked down by years of footsteps. Every step sends a small puff of dust into the air, which settles on everything in the room, including your already smoky hair. Oddly, thieves are a standard part of life here, almost like alarm clocks reminding everyone that the day has begun or ended, depending on how much sleep you've managed to snatch between tending animals and avoiding collapsing ceilings. Scholars still argue whether people truly noticed these pests, or if they were just background noise in a life so full of other dangers. As you move closer to the center of the home, you see the array of furniture: simple wooden benches, multi-purpose tables, and perhaps a stool that doubles as storage. Everything is rough-hewn, practical, and designed to last through years of hard use. There's no luxury here, no ornamental carvings, no soft pillows, just survival. And yet, in the faint firelight, you notice the care people took to make do. Perhaps it's a folded piece of cloth on a bench, or a carefully swept patch of floor. Small human touches in a world that's otherwise unforgiving. You probably won't spend much time appreciating that fire. Its warmth is fleeting, its light dim, and every so often a spark leaps too high, reminding you that disaster is only a misstep away. Open hearths are beautiful and necessary, but they're also dangerous. A poorly placed log or a startled animal can turn this humble home into a blazing inferno in minutes. Scholars still argue whether fire was the leading cause of death in medieval villages, but you don't need data to understand why everyone treats it with a mixture of reverence and terror. By now, your senses are overwhelmed. The smell of smoke and damp straw, the sound of creatures in the walls, the touch of rough furniture, the faint taste of dust in your mouth, it's all part of the package. And yet you can't help but be fascinated. There's something mesmerizing about the struggle of daily life, about how humans adapt to conditions that we, in our modern comfort, can barely imagine. You wander past the sleeping areas, past the hearth, and peer into the corners where food might be stored, where animals might curl up. Every inch of this home has a story, a struggle, and perhaps a tiny triumph tucked into it. And as your eyes adjust to the dim glow, you realize that the medieval home was more than just a shelter. It was a battleground for survival, a theater for daily dramas, and a place where humanity's resourcefulness met relentless challenge. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment with your location and the local time. It's fun to know where our fellow night wanderers are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wander further into the home, feeling the creak of the floorboards beneath your feet. The straw crunches slightly, and the warmth from the hearth barely reaches your toes. You notice the uneven walls, the smoke-stained beams, and the faint shadows that flicker across the room. Every detail, from the wooden latch on the door to the small clay pots near the hearth, speaks of a life dictated by necessity, by survival, and by a strange, stubborn resilience. You probably won't want to spend the night here, but you can't help but admire the ingenuity. From makeshift insulation to clever storage, humans found ways to live with very little, and yet their homes were worlds unto themselves. Every family had their own little adaptations. Every room had a story, and every corner held secrets of life, death, and the small comforts in between. You lean back slightly, taking in the scene, imagining yourself navigating the cramped space, dodging the livestock, avoiding the smoke, and somehow finding a moment of quiet amidst the chaos. You step outside, and the first thing that strikes you is the smell, or rather, the combination of smells that refuses to let you breathe easy. The homes, simple as they are held together by mud, straw, and the occasional wisp of hope. Thatched roofs sag under the weight of damp weather, and you notice that they aren't just decorative. They're the primary shield between you and the relentless elements. Rain doesn't just drip, it leaks in slow, steady streams that stain the floors below. You squint up at the roof and wonder if anyone ever considered that maybe a waterproof tarp could have been handy. Scholars still argue whether medieval builders intentionally used thick straw for insulation or simply because they had no better materials. And honestly, you can see both sides. You lean closer and inspect the walls. Wattle and daub, the medieval equivalent of DIY construction, looks more like a stack of sticks glued together with mud than a proper wall. Each crack is a potential entryway for wind, rain, or that persistent neighborly curiosity that seems to peek in whenever the door opens. Oddly, the smell of the mud itself is strangely grounding, earthy, a reminder that humans were truly connected to the soil back then. You can almost imagine families sitting in this very home, the dirt floor between them, trying to make sense of the world while battling the constant damp and chill. Step inside one of these tiny homes, and you immediately notice how the construction defines the life within. The walls are thin, yet they do a surprisingly decent job of keeping out the worst of the cold winds. Yet, the gaps and cracks mean that a draft sneaks in almost constantly, threading its way around blankets, furniture, and even the animals. You probably won't want to spend a winter here, but you can't help but marvel at the ingenuity. Those same walls that feel precarious also provide a home, a haven, and a sense of identity for the people who live within them. And then there's the straw. Everywhere you look, straw is doing multiple jobs. It lines the roof, of course, but it's also scattered across the floor to absorb moisture, sometimes stuffed into walls for extra insulation, and occasionally used as bedding. Oddly enough, the straw is both a comfort and a menace. It's itchy, it harbors pests, and you can almost hear the tiny skittering of insects hidden inside. Yet, without it, the home would be cold, damp, and unbearable. Scholars debate whether this primitive insulation was actually effective or simply a symbolic comfort. But when you run your fingers across the walls, feeling the straw protrude through the mud, you sense that it did its job in a rough, unrefined way. Waterproofing was another challenge. You notice that the roofs aren't smooth. The straw is uneven, overlapping in layers that create small pockets where water collects before trickling down to the eaves. During heavy rain, these homes must have been in a constant state of minor flooding. You can almost hear the sound of plink, plink, plink of water finding its way into the floor, soaking into whatever straw or wood it touches. And yet, life goes on. Animals are herded closer to the hearth for warmth. Blankets are rearranged to soak up the worst of the moisture. And the family keeps eating, working, and sleeping, as if these minor inconveniences are just part of daily life. You wander further along the walls, touching the rough texture. Every stick, every smear of mud is evidence of human labor. Oddly, you notice that some homes have decorative patterns pressed into the dog. Perhaps it's an attempt to make the space feel less dreary. A medieval version of wall art. Or maybe just the mark of whoever mixed the mud that day. Scholars still argue whether these patterns were purely aesthetic or held symbolic meaning. But either way, it's a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, people sought beauty or at least variety. Then there's the smell again. But now it's joined by another layer damp straw mixed with wood smoke from the hearth, the faint tang of livestock, and the earthiness of the mud itself. You probably won't think of these odors as homey. Yet in this context, they are reassuring. They signal that the hearth is working. The walls are standing, and life messy, uncomfortable and full of challenges continues. Outside, you see the roof lines of neighboring homes. Each one is slightly different. Each one bears its own sag and weathering. But all of them follow the same principle: mud, straw, and a stubborn determination to keep the inhabitants alive. Oddly, this sameness creates a kind of comforting rhythm. You can almost hear the imagined conversations between neighbors, over fences and walls, about leaks, storms, and perhaps who is the most persistent rat problem. Scholars still debate whether medieval villagers were socialized more by necessity or by shared suffering. And standing here, you can almost feel both influences at play. Moving closer, you notice that the homes aren't just built to shelter humans, they're designed with animals in mind too. Chickens, pigs, and sometimes even cows find a place either inside or immediately adjacent to the home. This integration means warmth, but it also means odor and constant vigilance. Oddly enough, people considered animals essential companions in survival, even if their presence made hygiene nearly impossible. The straw that cushions a sleeping child might also be cushioning a chicken. Scholars argue whether this proximity contributed more to disease or simply made life practical. And you can see evidence of both just by looking at the floors. Finally, you pause at the threshold of the home, looking at the layered, crooked roof, the walls of wattle and daub, and the straw that has so many jobs it could have its own employment contract. You probably won't want to live here permanently, but there is a strange charm in the raw practicality, the sheer human ingenuity, and the adaptation to conditions that modern comfort could never replicate. And while the rain taps gently on the roof and the wind whistles through the cracks, you realize that life imperfect, messy, and relentless persists in every crevice of these medieval homes. You step inside one of these medieval homes, and immediately you realize that privacy is a concept as foreign as indoor plumbing. One room, one space, one life, or rather, multiple lives all jostling together like an overstuffed bag of laundry. Entire families share this single area, their belongings scattered on the dirt floor or piled onto rudimentary benches. Animals, too, have found a cozy spot near the hearth or in a corner, providing warmth but adding to the chaos. You probably won't appreciate the ingenuity of sleeping arrangements until you see a child tucked next to a sheep, a mother curling around a tiny bundle of straw, and perhaps even a neighbor who's been invited in after the pub. Scholars still argue whether the animals were considered part of the family or merely survival tools. But standing here, it's hard to tell the difference. You wander further, taking in the scene: a table doubling as storage, a bench that serves as a bed, and a pile of blankets that has been rearranged so many times that it's both comforting and terrifying. Oddly, this is where you notice the clever improvisation of medieval inhabitants. A stool might hide coins beneath it, a chest might secretly store spare food, and a hanging piece of cloth could divide sleeping spaces without the need for walls. In a single room, multiple lives are lived, shared, and somehow survived, despite the constant presence of pests, smoke, and the faint smell of damp straw. The sleeping arrangements themselves are an adventure in practicality. Children often sleep at the feet of adults, both to conserve warmth and because beds are scarce. Scholars still debate whether children actually slept well in these conditions, or if their nights were filled with nudges, bumps, and the occasional squeak from an animal. Oddly enough, some families had clever ways of creating personal space: a blanket stretched across a bench, a small curtain hung from a beam, or even a stack of hay to separate the human from the livestock. It's crude, it's uncomfortable, and yet it works. Survival is the art here, and comfort is a distant luxury. You notice the walls again: mud and straw, blackened from harsh smoke, adorned with rough shelves where people stack their essentials. Oddly, each family seems to have developed its own system of organization amid the chaos. A pot for water, a bowl for leftovers, a bench that doubles as storage, all carefully arranged so that daily life can continue without total disaster. Scholars still argue whether these homes were chaotic by necessity or design, but you can't help but admire the order within apparent disorder. Animals take up space you might not expect. Chickens cluck softly near a corner, a goat chews thoughtfully on straw near the fire, and even a cat might patrol the edges for rodents. You probably won't be sharing your modern bed with a goat anytime soon, but here their presence is as natural as breathing. Oddly, the heat from the animals contributes significantly to the household warmth. Without them, winters would be even more merciless. Scholars still debate whether the practice of keeping livestock indoors was more about convenience or survival, but clearly, medieval families valued practicality above all else. You step carefully around a sleeping toddler, noticing how tightly everyone is packed. There's no private corner, no separate room, and certainly no space for solitude. Oddly, this seems to create a strong sense of interdependence. Everyone knows the habits of everyone else. Movements are synchronized to avoid disturbance. Meals are planned around availability of space, and arguments are often as much about proximity as anything else. Scholars still argue whether this closeness strengthened family bonds or simply created tension, but you can feel the constant negotiation of space in every glance and gesture. Then there's the odd detail of storage. With limited room, families had to get creative. Baskets hung from beams, chests doubled as seating, and even the hearth area might hold cooking utensils, firewood, and sometimes valuables all in one shared space. You probably won't want to try this at home, but it's ingenious in its own rough, utilitarian way. The medieval mindset prioritized survival, efficiency, and adaptability over anything else, and these homes are the perfect reflection of that philosophy. Meals were equally communal. You wander toward the hearth, where the faint aroma of a simple stew drifts into the room. Oddly, everyone eats together from one or two shared bowls, and the act of sharing food becomes a subtle ritual of community and survival. Scholars still argue whether this communal style was merely practical or a reflection of social norms. But there's a warmth in the togetherness that seems to defy the harshness of the environment. By now, you notice that light is sparse. Small, uneven windows let in shards of sun or moonlight, barely illuminating the corners where children nap or animals curl up. You probably won't appreciate the darkness until you feel the contrast, the shadowy corners, the glow of the hearth, and the tiny flicker of a tallow lamp that barely reaches beyond its immediate vicinity. Oddly, this dimness creates a rhythm, a way to mark day and night, even without clocks. Scholars still argue whether people truly relied on natural light or adapted so thoroughly to darkness that artificial lighting was secondary. But the effect is palpable. Life is lived in close quarters, and darkness is as much a companion as the people around you. Finally, you pause to absorb the full reality. One room, multiple lives, countless tiny struggles, and a remarkable ingenuity that makes survival possible. You see the interplay of humans, animals, and space in a constant negotiation, a dance choreographed by necessity. You probably won't want to move into such a home, but there is an undeniable fascination in seeing how life adapts when the luxury of space and comfort is stripped away. Every corner, every nook, every shared blanket tells a story of resilience, resourcefulness, and the strange beauty of survival against the odds. You shift your attention to the hearth, that flickering heart of every medieval home, and immediately sense the danger that lurks alongside its warmth. Open fires were essential for cooking, heating, and even light, yet they were as precarious as a tightrope over a pit of coals. Sparks fly, embers escape, and the slightest mishap could turn a cozy home into a roaring inferno. You probably won't want to play with fire here, but standing by it, you can almost feel the tension families lived with every single day. Scholars still argue whether fire was the leading cause of accidental death in medieval villages. But even without statistics, the risk is palpable in every charred beam and soot-stained wall. The hearth doesn't just warm the home, it dictates its layout. Benches, tables, and sleeping areas are all arranged to maximize the reacher heat. Oddly enough, this arrangement also meant that every household member developed a precise knowledge of personal territory. Step too close, and you might burn yourself or disturb the carefully balanced warmth shared among humans and animals alike. The open flames create dancing shadows that stretch across the walls, giving the small home an almost theatrical quality, as if every chore, every meal, every nap is part of a silent play performed daily. And yet, fire is unpredictable. A gust of wind through the thin walls, a stray ember from stirring the pot, or even the sudden movement of a sleeping goat could spark disaster. You probably wouldn't survive long if you weren't constantly vigilant, but medieval inhabitants became masters of this delicate balancing act. Oddly, families would sometimes build small iron grills or rudimentary chimneys for their time just to direct smoke and minimize danger. Scholars still debate how effective these innovations were in preventing fires, but the effort itself highlights human adaptability. Smoke is another constant companion. It curls lazily toward the ceiling but never fully leaves. Blackened beams are testament to years of inhaled soot, and your eyes water as you take in the smell, a mix of burning wood, cooked food, and faintly acrid undertones that hint at countless close calls. Oddly, this smoke also has a protective role, keeping insects at bay and signaling when meals are ready. Scholars still argue whether smoke-filled interiors were considered a nuisance or a necessity. But standing here, it's clear that people adapted to it as naturally as the cold or the darkness. You glance at the walls and notice scorch marks near the hearth. These aren't merely accidental. They're stories etched into wood and daub. A charred patch might indicate a misjudged log, an excited child, or an animal that brushed too close. Oddly, these imperfections act as warnings, teaching each generation where to place spots, where to arrange seating, and how to move safely around the flames. Scholars still debate whether people learn it more from trial or tradition. But the lesson is clear: fire commands respect, attention, and a hint of fear. Cooking itself is an exercise in balance and dexterity. Pots hang over flames, soups bubble precariously, and meats roast slowly above embers. You probably wouldn't last a day without singed hair or burnt fingers. But medieval cooks became adept at reading the fire, judging its temperament by color, sound, and scent, hinting at early engineering skills born out of necessity. Scholars still argue whether these innovations were widespread or localized, but their existence proves humans will tinker, adapt, and innovate to survive. The fire's warmth is fleeting. Winters bite hard, and the hearth can only do so much against icy drafts slipping through the thin walls and gaps in the roof. You notice family members huddled closer to the flames, their blankets pulled tight, their livestock pressed to their sides. Oddly, these shared moments, born out of survival instinct, also become intimate rituals, a quiet camaraderie in a harsh environment. Scholars still debate whether this closeness was purely functional or also emotional, but the effect is undeniable: warmth, both physical and psychological, radiates from the hearth. You probably won't enjoy the constant vigilance required around the fire. Each ember is a potential disaster, each gust of wind a threat, each clumsy step a reminder of mortality. And yet there's a rhythm to it: a slow, steady dance of adding wood, stoking coals, tending animals, cooking meals, and keeping watch. Oddly, this rhythm shapes life itself. Tasks are timed around the fire, stories are shared beside it, and even sleep is influenced by its glow and warmth. Scholars still argue whether daily routines evolved around fire or whether fire simply adapted to routines. But standing here, you can't separate the two. Finally, you lean back slightly, inhaling the smoky air, feeling both the comfort and danger of the hearth. Open flames are terrifying and vital, destructive and life-sustaining. You probably won't want to spend a night here without learning the unwritten rules of fire survival. But there is a strange beauty in the balance, the way humans negotiate warmth, light, and danger in one small, smoky room. Every charred beam, every flicker, every careful movement tells the story of resilience, ingenuity, and the relentless quest to make a home amid chaos. Your gaze drifts downward, and that's when reality hits. The floor isn't solid wood or polished stone, it's bare dirt, compacted over countless footsteps and layered with straw. You probably won't find this appealing, but it's the foundation of medieval life. Literally and figuratively, every step sends a tiny cloud of dust into the air, mingling with the smoke from the hearth and the damp scent of straw. Oddly, these floors are alive in more ways than one. Fleas, lice, and other tiny pests make their home here, skittering invisibly underfoot, sometimes jumping onto and worry ankles like mischievous little alarm clocks. Scholars still argue whether these infestations were considered a nuisance or a fact of life. But either way, they are omnipresent, shaping the daily experience of anyone who dares to walk here barefoot. The dirt floor also serves as a remarkable multitasking surface. Food spills, straw bedding, livestock resting spots, and children playing, everything happens on the same patch of earth. You probably won't want to eat directly off it, yet families develop rituals to minimize contamination. Oddly, some people would sprinkle herbs on the floor, not just for fragrance, but because certain scents were believed to repel pests. Lavender, rosemary, and sometimes even juniper served as primitive defenses against both fleas and foul smells. Scholars still debate whether these herbal strategies were effective or more psychological comfort than functional, but they demonstrate an awareness of the environment that's surprisingly sophisticated. As you walk carefully around the room, your eyes catch tiny, almost imperceptible movements: the scurrying of rats along the edges, the flick of a flea here, a small insect there. Oddly, these creatures are so integrated into daily life that people barely react unless they become truly bothersome. Scholars still argue whether these pests significantly affected health. And indeed, historical records are murky. But you can imagine sleepless nights when bites made trust nearly impossible. These tiny companions remind you that the medieval home was shared by far more than just humans. The floor is also a stage for resourcefulness. Families would spread straw in sleeping areas, not just for warmth, but for some semblance of cushioning. Oddly, the same straw that comforts you also harbors vermin, creating an ironic blend of safety and risk. Scholars still argue whether this practice was more beneficial or harmful, yet every generation seems to have continued it, suggesting that its advantages outweighed the nuisance. You might crinkle your nose at the thought, but in this environment, practicality trumps comfort, or at least redefines it. The dirt floor also plays a critical role in temperature regulation. In summer, it stays cool, and in winter, the combination of straw and human or animal heat keeps it bearable. Oddly, this natural insulation works in tandem with the hearth and layered walls, creating microclimates within each home. Scholars still debate whether medieval builders intentionally engineered floors this way or if it was accidental. But your feet can feel the difference: damp, cool patches alongside slightly warmer, trodden areas. Then there's the issue of cleaning or the lack thereof. Sweeping might happen occasionally, but dust, dirt, and stray bits of straw accumulate relentlessly. Oddly, this accumulation creates a living record of the household's daily life footprints. Dropped food and animal tracks all etch their stories into the earth. Scholars still argue whether this neglect contributed significantly to disease or whether the human body simply adapted. But there's no denying that life on the dirt floor is a constant negotiation between hygiene, comfort, and survival. Animals on these floors add another layer of complexity. Chickens scratch, goats shuffle, and cats patrol for mice. Oddly, this constant movement contributes to warmth, distributing heat throughout the room. Yet it also brings mud droppings and the occasional surprise underfoot. Scholars still debate whether keeping animals indoors was more about practicality or necessity. But the evidence is clear: medieval humans shared their space with creatures large and small, making the floor an ecosystem in miniature. Sleeping on the floor is its own adventure. Oddly, people would pile straw, sometimes layering blankets or animal hides, to create a semi-comfortable bed. You probably won't find this luxurious, but it was functional. Scholars still argue how much actual rest could be obtained in these conditions, given the pests, smells, and cramped spaces. But life moved forward regardless. Families adapted to the discomfort, finding moments of rest amidst constant challenges. And in that adaptation lies a quiet kind of resilience. You pause to consider the sensory overload: dust in your nose, the faint rustle of pests in the straw, the uneven surface beneath your feet. Oddly, despite all this, there's a rhythm to it, a way humans move, sleep, and interact that turns what we might see as chaos into a managed, if uncomfortable, environment. Scholars still debate the psychological effects of living this close to the earth and its countless tiny creatures. But you can't help but admire the way people navigated these conditions with creativity, patience, and sometimes a sense of humor. Finally, you settle onto a patch of straw, feeling the rough texture under your fingers and the uneven surface beneath your back. You probably won't want to spend a full night here, yet there's something grounding about the dirt floor, about the way it anchors human life to the earth. Oddly, in this intimate connection to the ground, you start to sense the pulse of medieval living, a world where survival, ingenuity, and the presence of countless tiny creatures intertwined to create a strange, compelling ecosystem of home life. And though fleas, dust, and rats might make you squirm, there's no denying that this humble floor has witnessed generations of human experience, each footprint telling its own story. Your eyes adjust to the dim interior, and you notice something immediately. Light is scarce. Windows, if they exist at all, are tiny slits high in the walls or covered with oiled parchment that barely lets the sun or moon through. You probably won't think much of it now, but imagine months spent in near perpetual gloom, where the distinction between day and night is sometimes marked only by the leftist smoke in the room or the faint warmth from the hearth. Oddly, this darkness shapes behavior, routines, and even social interaction. Scholars still argue whether medieval people adapted physiologically to low light or if they relied heavily on memory and habit. But it's undeniable that dim interiors dictated much of daily life. You wander toward one of the small windows, peering through the thin parchment. Oddly, it's enough to give a sense of the outside world, but not enough to see much detail. Shadows from neighboring roofs stretch across your view, and you can imagine how the lack of clear visibility would have influenced daily schedules. Scholars still debate whether windows were intentionally small to conserve heat or merely a result of construction limitations. But either way, your imagination fills in the world beyond the walls with a soft, blurry haze. Inside, the absence of natural light creates its own rhythm. You probably won't realize it, but daily tasks had to be synchronized with the availability of sunlight, moving chores closer to the hearth or lanterns as necessary. Oddly, this scarcity fosters certain intimacy. Shadows play across faces. Movements are deliberate, and the flickering glow of fire or a tallow lamp casts an almost hypnotic ambience. Scholars still argue whether people were more attuned to time through the sun or by observing these subtle internal cues. But the effect is clear. Light and dark dictate life here. The few openings in the walls also influence ventilation, or lack thereof. A draft sneaks in around every crevice, and at night, cold air seeps through the tiny windows, chilling the sleeping areas. Oddly, families often use this to their advantage, strategically placing bedding and animals to block the worst of the cold. Scholars still debate how intentional this arrangement was versus learned through trial and error, but you can see the method, and the apparent chaos warmth is negotiated carefully. With each inch of light or air considered, you probably won't be impressed by the view, but there's something mesmerizing about the dim interior punctuated by tiny shards of daylight or candle glow. Oddly, people decorated these windows minimally, sometimes hanging herbs to filter light or ward off pests, sometimes leaving them bare to maximize what little illumination there is. Scholars still argue whether these practices were symbolic, functional, or purely aesthetic, but they speak to a constant human desire to shape even slightly the harsh environment of a home. At night, the darkness takes on a different character. Shadows grow long, hearth flames cast erratic patterns, and the small windows provide just enough light to hint at the outside world. You probably won't feel safe wandering here alone, yet there is a kind of magic in this interplay between gloom and glow. Oddly, families may have used the dimness for practical reasons, like sleeping patterns or protecting valuables from prying eyes, creating a domestic choreography that balances survival with daily life. Scholars still argue whether these adaptations were conscious strategies or emergent behaviors, but the result is the same. All life intimately bound to the presence or absence of light. The lack of windows also affects social dynamics. With minimal ability to observe the outside world, news, weather, and events were often shared orally among neighbors or travelers. Oddly, this fostered a communal reliance on storytelling and memory, as opposed to modern reliance on visual cues. Scholars still debate whether this strengthened community bonds or increased vulnerability to misinformation. But there's no doubt that the window or its absence shaped how people understood their environment. You probably won't envy someone sitting here for months on end. Yet there's an unexpected intimacy in the dimness. It encourages quiet observation, careful movement, and a deeper awareness of the senses beyond sight sound. Smell, touch, and warmth all take on amplified importance. Oddly, this sensory sharpening likely helped medieval people navigate their cramped, dark homes with remarkable dexterity. Scholars still argue whether this adaptation was universal or varied across regions. But standing here, you can feel what the darkness itself teaches, warns and molds daily life. Finally, you glance around, noting how little light penetrates the room and how every flicker of flame, every slit of sunlight, becomes precious. You probably won't want more entirely in this dim world, yet you can appreciate the skill required to manage daily life under such conditions. Oddly, the lack of windows also creates a cozy, enclosed atmosphere where shadows dance. Warmth circulates in pockets, and life messy, cramped, and dim continues with a rhythm dictated by light, fire, and the ever-present creativity of those who call this dark space home. You start noticing the roof more closely now. Patched and uneven, it seems almost alive with its own little ecosystem. You probably won't be thrilled to learn that those bundles of straw aren't just insulation, they're perfect hideouts for insects, birds, and the occasional mouse. Oddly, people seem to tolerate this, either out of necessity or because the benefits outweighed the discomfort. Scholars still argue whether the presence of pests in roofs contributed significantly to disease or if it was simply a manageable inconvenience. But it's undeniable that life under a thatched roof came with constant, subtle challenges. The roof's design is both ingenious and precarious. Straw layers are thick, overlapping to create channels for rainwater, but they sag over time, letting moisture seep in during heavy storms. You probably won't want to be underneath it during a downpour. Yet these roofs kept people alive in all but the harshest weather. Oddly, some families would pack the straw either in certain areas, almost instinctively reinforcing weak spots without realizing they were performing early forms of maintenance engineering. Scholars still debate whether such practices were learned systematically or through trial and error, but it's clear that survival demanded constant observation and adaptation. Looking closer, you notice small wooden beams supporting the roof. They're rough-hewn, often blackened from smoke, and occasionally warped. Oddly, these beams tell stories of the home's age. Heavier sagging indicates years of settlement. Minor cracks hint at past repairs, and blackened sections mark where sparks once flew to high from the hearth below. Scholars still argue whether people intentionally replaced these beams on schedules or only when failure became obvious. But standing here, you see the interplay of human ingenuity and natural wear. The thatch also impacts interior life in surprising ways. It absorbs heat from the hearth during winter and releases it slowly, creating small pockets of warmth above sleeping areas. Oddly, this passive heating technique would have made the home more bearable, even if the floor remained cold. Scholars still debate whether medieval people understood the science of heat transfer or merely discovered the effect through observation. But either way, it shows a keen, adaptive intelligence working quietly behind everyday survival. The waterproofing was a constant concern. Rain leaking through a poorly maintained roof could ruin bedding, food, and even stored valuables. You probably won't appreciate how nerve-wracking this was. Yet people developed simple but clever solutions: layers of mud or clay on top of the straw, pitch for sealing leaks, or just constant vigilance during storms. Oddly, some families even created small internal channels to divert drips away from sleeping areas. Scholars still argue how widespread these fixes were, but the evidence suggests that ingenuity often outpaced available materials. Animals were intimately connected to the roof too. Birds sometimes nested in straw gaps, and occasionally small mammals would find their way inside, adding life and occasional chaos above your head. You probably won't want to cohabit with creatures nesting in your ceiling. But the reality of medieval homes included constant negotiation with the natural world. Oddly, these tiny cohabitants were sometimes tolerated for their secondary benefits, like insect control or even subtle warmth. Scholars still debate whether this was intentional symbiosis or sheer necessity, but either interpretation underscores human adaptability. You notice the smell again, the mix of wet straw, earth, and faint smoke lingering near the rafters. Oddly, this smell becomes familiar, almost comforting, signaling the presence of home, hearth, and life continuing despite discomfort. Scholars still argue whether people were desensitized to odors in their environment or if they were acutely aware. But your senses are now hyper-aware, translating the scent into a narrative of endurance and adaptation. Lighting under the roof is peculiar. Shadows flicker and stretch with the hearth's flame, creating a kaleidoscope of shapes. You probably won't get used to it quickly. Yet these dancing shadows serve as subtle guides, alerting you to movement or unexpected intrusions. Oddly, the interplay of light and dark may have aided nocturnal vigilance, allowing inhabitants to detect pests or intruders more easily. Scholars still debate whether this was a conscious benefit or simply an incidental feature, but its presence shapes the rhythm of life indoors. Finally, as you lie back and consider the roof overhead, you appreciate the delicate balance it represents. You probably won't want to trust your life to thatch without understanding it first. Yet it embodies the medieval spirit: creativity, pragmatism, and adaptation intertwined with daily survival. Oddly, every sag, crack, and hidden gap becomes part of a living system, shaping how people moved, slept, and lived beneath it. Scholars still argue over how intentional each design choice was, but the lived experience makes it unmistakably clear the roof is more than shelter. It's a silent partner in a complex, challenging, yet remarkable domestic life. Your attention now shifts to the windows, those tiny, barrel-for slits that barely let in the world outside. You probably won't think much of them at first glance, but they are both gateways and barriers, a connection to sunlight, moonlight, and weather, yet a thin shield against wind, rain, and prying eyes. Oddly, medieval people treated windows with a mix of practicality and superstition. Scholars still argue whether glass was intentionally rare due to cost or fragility, or simply because small openings were safer and easier to maintain. But the result is a dimly lit interior that shapes daily life in unexpected ways. Peering through one of these narrow openings, you notice the play of light and shadow across the room. Oddly, this limited sunlight forces occupants to rely on memory, sound, and touch to navigate their home, sharpening senses that modern humans often take for granted. Scholars still debate whether the scarcity of light influenced human cognition or social behaviors. But standing here, you feel the subtle discipline of a world regulated by illumination. The design of the windows themselves is a curious mix of necessity and artistry. Some are covered with oiled parchment, which diffuses light into a soft glow. Others are open slits with wooden shutters to be closed in storms. You probably won't realize it immediately, but each small window reflects an intricate balance, enough light for tasks, but not so much that heat escapes in winter. Oddly, some villagers even hung cloth or herbs to filter incoming light and repel pests, blending function with subtle decoration. Scholars still argue how widespread these practices were, yet the ingenuity behind each solution is undeniable. Windows also play a role in social dynamics. With limited visibility, neighbors rely on oral communication, shouted greetings, or the occasional peek through a narrow slit. Oddly, this creates a culture where storytelling, observation, and memory are heightened, replacing the modern dependence on constant visual cues. Scholars still debate whether this contributed to stronger community bonds or increased gossip, but it certainly added texture to social life. Ventilation is another hidden function of these windows. Oddly, the draft that sneaks through tiny cracks can make a room chilly in winter yet slightly breathable in summer. Circulating smoke from the hearth and dispersing odors from both cooking and livestock. Scholars still argue whether medieval people understood these effects consciously or if adjustments were purely intuitive. But their homes demonstrate a practical mastery of airflow long before scientific analysis. You probably won't find the view particularly scenic. It's off and blocked by neighboring roofs, trees or walls, giving only glimpses of a street or yard. Oddly, these tiny glimpses shape perception of the outside world. Glimpses of weather, movement, and the changing seasons act as guides for daily routines. Scholars still debate whether these visual cues were more important than clocks or other timekeeping methods, but they were essential to planning work, meals, and rest. The placement of windows also reveals social hierarchies. Higher windows, or those with slightly better light, might indicate status, a subtle way to distinguish families without grandiose displays. Oddly, even in humble homes, these subtle cues mattered, reflecting awareness of social positioning. Scholars still argue how consciously these distinctions were made, but they hint at a culture attentive to both function and subtle signaling. At night, the windows take on another function. With minimal external light, tiny slits allow moonlight to drift in, casting faint patterns across the floor and walls. Oddly, this soft illumination might have helped with nighttime movement, allowing people to see without risking fire hazards from candles or hearth flames. Scholars still debate whether this was an intentional design or merely incidental, yet it reinforces the intimate connection between the physical structure and the rhythms of life. Finally, as you trace your fingers along the rough frame, you realize that windows, though small and scarce, are integral to survival, comfort, and perception. You probably won't want to navigate life entirely through these tiny openings. Yet they shape light, airflow, and awareness in ways modern homes rarely consider. Oddly, these small portals to the outside world create a subtle dialogue between indoors and out, reinforcing both the ingenuity and constraints of medieval living. You notice the walls more carefully now, and it's clear they are far from uniform, more polished. Made of wattle and daub, rough stone, or timber, these walls are a patchwork of materials held together with mud, straw, and sheer determination. You probably won't find them impressive by modern standards, but they are surprisingly functional. Oddly, each wall tells a story. Black and Darius hint at years of smoke. Small holes reveal where repairs were made, and uneven surfaces create tiny niches where tools, utensils, or keepsakes were tucked away. Scholars still argue whether the choice of materials was driven purely by availability or by conscious insulation strategies. But either way, survival shaped their design. The walls are surprisingly alive with their own ecosystem. Fleas, insects, and even small rodents find refuge in cracks and crevices. Oddly, these inhabitants are tolerated to a degree because they serve indirect purposes. Some insects keep wasps in check, and rodents indicate areas where food stores need attention. Scholars still debate whether these infestations had measurable impacts on health, but you can sense that medieval people lived in constant negotiation with the tiny creatures sharing their home. Storage solutions are built directly into the walls. Oddly, niches, beams, and hooks transform rough surfaces into functional spaces for pots, herbs, and clothing. You probably won't imagine using walls as furniture today. Yet in this environment, vertical space is as precious as horizontal. Scholars still argue whether such adaptations were the result of deliberate planning or gradual improvisation, but they exemplify a key medieval principle: make do with what you have. The walls also play a subtle role in temperature control. Mud and straw provide insulation, keeping interiors warmer in winter and cooler in summer. Oddly, Some designs include slight overhangs or double layers that hint at intuitive engineering knowledge. Scholars still debate whether this knowledge was widespread or localized. But the basic principle is evident: walls weren't just boundaries, they were tools for survival. Decoration is minimal but telling. Oddly, medieval inhabitants sometimes scratched simple symbols into walls: crosses, initials, or geometric patterns. You probably won't understand the full significance, but these marks might protect the household, commemorate births, or even serve as reminders of family members. Scholars still argue whether these markings had primarily symbolic or practical purposes, but they show the human need to leave a trace even in the harshest conditions. You probably won't notice it immediately, but the walls also regulate sound. Thick mud or timber absorbs some noise, but the overall effect is a constant low hum of human, animal, and environmental activity. Oddly, this creates a sense of intimacy. Every cough, shuffle, and whisper carries significance. Scholars still debate whether this heightened auditory awareness influenced social interactions, but it's clear that life in medieval homes was a sensory negotiation. Moisture is another constant concern. You notice small patches where water has seeped through, creating damp streaks or moldy corners. Oddly, families learned to manage this by rearranging furniture, raising beds on straw or planks, and layering mud for repair. Scholars still argue whether these methods significantly improved living conditions, but the practice of ongoing maintenance is itself a testament to resilience. The blackened surfaces from hearth smoke are particularly telling. Oddly, these marks also serve as indicators. Darker patches meant the fire had been maintained consistently. Lighter areas suggested drafts or poor airflow. You probably won't think of soot as useful. Yet for the medieval household, it was an accidental guide to domestic management. Scholars still debate whether people consciously interpreted smoke patterns or simply learn it from experience. But the result is an environment shaped by both trial and intuition. Finally, as you trace your hand along the rough, cool surface of the wall, you appreciate the interplay between form and function. You probably won't find beauty in the rough daub or warped timber. Yet every crack, niche, and smudge represents centuries of adaptation, ingenuity, and quiet persistence. Oddly, the walls are as alive as the people who inhabit them, silently documenting survival strategies, human ingenuity, and the lived experience of life in a world without modern comforts. You begin to notice the ceiling beams stretching across the room, rough-hewn and dark and from years of smoke. You probably won't be impressed by their appearance. They're crooked, splintered, and sometimes dangerously low, but they are the skeleton that holds the home together. Oddly, these beams also serve secondary purposes. They act as storage for baskets, herbs, and occasionally even sleeping mats. Scholars still argue whether this dual-purpose use was intentional or purely out of necessity. But either way, it highlights the medieval skill for multifunctionality in limited space. Looking closer, you see evidence of repairs: splints of wood nailed haphazardly, patches of daub filling gaps, and rope bindings reinforcing weak spots. You probably won't want to trust your light entirely to these repairs, yet people depended on them daily. Oddly, the very irregularity of the beams adds strength in some cases, distributing weight unpredictably but effectively across the structure. Scholars still debate whether this was an understood principle or just fortunate happenstance, but the results were sufficient to keep homes standing through storms and harsh winters. You probably won't realize it immediately, but the beams influence light and shadow as well. Sunlight streaming through tiny windows creates long, shifting patterns across the room, dancing along the beams and walls. Oddly, this natural spectacle might have helped people gauge time or detect movement at night, functioning as an unintentional clock or security system. Scholars still argue whether the interplay of light and structure was ever consciously utilized. But it subtly shapes perception and daily routines. The beams are also intimate markers of daily life. Oddly, scratches, soot marks, and notches reveal past events, a child's handprint, an accidental scrape from moving furniture, or the residue of cooking smoke. You probably won't notice them at first, yet each mark tells a story, a small record of human presence and adaptation. Scholars still debate how much of this was intentional versus incidental, but the evidence of lived experience is undeniable. Animals interact with the beams in surprising ways. Cats climb the rough surfaces to hunt pests, and birds sometimes build nests in cracks. You probably won't want wildlife nesting above your head. Yet for medieval families, these interactions were tolerated and even subtly beneficial. Oddly, the constant movement and life overhead contributed to warmth distribution and pest control, making the home a microecosystem. Scholars still argue whether this was deliberate management or sheer coincidence, but it's a testament to the intricate decadence of human and animal life in these spaces. You notice the smell again: wood, soot, and faint herbs tucked along the beams. Oddly, this scent creates a sensory map for inhabitants, signaling proximity to the hearth, areas for cooking, and sleeping zones. You probably won't think of aroma as functional, but it subtly guides behavior and daily routines. Scholars still debate whether medieval people consciously used scent as a tool or simply adapted to it, but there's no denying its impact on spatial awareness. The beams also serve as a subtle temperature buffer. In winter, they retain some warmth from the hearth, radiating it slowly downward. In summer, they provide shade and slight insulation from the heat. Oddly, this passive regulation shows an intuitive understanding of how materials interact with environment, even if it wasn't formally studied. Scholars still argue whether this knowledge was widespread or isolated, but the practical outcome is the same: life becomes slightly more bearable in extreme conditions. Finally, the beams influence social dynamics within the home. Their positioning dictates where people can move, where furniture is placed, and even where children can play safely. Oddly, these structural constraints force careful choreography of movement and interaction, shaping daily life as much as walls, floors, and hearths do. You probably won't survive long here without observing these cues, but you can see how generations of inhabitants learned to negotiate the space, blending caution, efficiency, and subtle creativity to make a challenging environment livable. You start noticing the sleeping arrangements, and it's clear that comfort is a relative concept here. Beds are simple straw mattresses, sometimes layered with animal hides, placed strategically near the hearth for warmth. You probably won't find them luxurious, but they're functional, offering just enough insulation from the cold. Uneven floors. Oddly, families often shared sleeping spaces with children, spouses, and sometimes even livestock, both for heat and protection. Scholars still debate whether co-sleeping was a matter of necessity or cultural preference, but the practice is widespread enough to suggest survival-dictated intimacy. You lie down on the straw, feeling its rough texture against your skin. Oddly, it's a strange combination of comfort and irritation, soft in patches, prickly in others, and alive with the subtle presence of insects. You probably won't want to fall asleep without vigilance. Yet medieval humans adapted, learning to distinguish between harmless annoyances and genuine threats. Scholars still argue whether repeated exposure desensitized people or whether instilled lifelong vigilance. But either way, the effect is undeniable. Temperature is a constant consideration in these sleeping areas. You notice how beds are placed to catch residual warmth from the hearth while avoiding drafts from doors or windows. Oddly, even small adjustments like raising a straw mattress on planks or clustering blankets dramatically affect comfort. Scholars still debate whether people consciously engineered these microclimates or simply learned it through trial and error. But the result is a careful, almost scientific approach to warmth and survival. Animals in the sleeping space are another layer of complexity. Cats, dogs, goats, or even chickens might nestle near the bedding. Oddly, this provides both warmth and pest control and reduces rodent activity, while simultaneously offering body heat. You probably won't enjoy sharing your bed with animals. Yet for medieval families, this cohabitation was a practical solution, blending necessity with convenience. Scholars still argue whether animals were valued more for companionship or utility. But the dual purpose is evident. You probably won't realize it immediately, but sleeping arrangements influence social hierarchy. Parents soft and claim the warmest spots, while children huddle on the edges. Oddly, older children might be assigned to share beds with younger siblings or animals to maximize retained heat. Scholars still debate whether this was intentional pedagogy or purely pragmatic, but it reflects a nuanced understanding of space, warmth, and familial roles. Noise is another factor affecting sleep. The thick walls and hearths smoke do little to muffle the sounds of creaking beams, animal movements, or outside weather. Oddly, this constant ambient noise serves as a subtle alarm system. Footsteps, rustling, or an unusual creak immediately alert inhabitants to potential threats. You probably won't find this soothing by modern standards. Yet medieval people attuned themselves to these cues, blending vigilance with rest. Scholars still debate how chronic noise exposure affected sleep quality or health, but adaptation was necessary for survival. Oddly, the smell also shapes your perception of rest. The combination of straw, hearth smoke, animals, and damp earth creates a unique, persistent aroma that signals home more effectively than any visual cue. You probably won't consciously recognize it, yet it influences how safely and comfortably you sleep. Scholars still argue whether such olfactory cues affected psychological well-being or simply reinforced routines. But the effect on perception is clear. Children often have their own sleeping rituals. You notice small areas designated for them, sometimes separated by low straw dividers or simple wooden frames. Oddly, these arrangements allow warmth sharing while maintaining a semblance of personal space, reflecting a subtle understanding of comfort, hierarchy, and developmental needs. Scholars still debate how intentional these divisions or whether they arose spontaneously, but they demonstrate early forms of domestic organization. Finally, as you stretch out and consider the combination of straw, warmth, animals, and darkness, you realize sleeping in a medieval home is a complex choreography of adaptation. You probably won't survive long without mastering the rules of space, heat, and vigilance, yet centuries of human ingenuity have made it manageable, even if far from modern luxury. Oddly, in this intimate environment, survival, comfort, and domestic rhythm are inseparable, and each night becomes both challenge and sanctuary. You shift your attention to the hearth, the undeniable heart of the medieval home. You probably won't overestimate its importance until you feel the warmth radiate. The soft flicker of flames casting dancing shadows across walls and ceiling beams. Oddly, it's far more than a source of heat. The hearth regulates almost every aspect of domestic life, from cooking to lighting to social gatherings. Scholars still argue whether placement of the hearth was primarily functional or symbolic, but it clearly anchors the home both physically and culturally. You notice how smoke curls upward, blackening the beams and walls over time. Oddly, this residue isn't merely a byproduct. It carries subtle information. Patterns in soot reveal airflow, frequency of fire use, and even potential hazards. You probably won't think of smoke as instructive, yet medieval families relied on these cues, adjusting firewood and positioning to optimize warmth while minimizing damage. Scholars still debate whether this observational skill was passed down deliberately or simply learned through experience. But the effect is undeniable. Cooking is an art of adaptation here. You watch as simple clay pots and iron cauldrons sit directly above the flames or on side hooks. Oddly, the arrangement allows for multiple dishes to be prepared simultaneously, using variable flame intensity in clever, unspoken ways. You probably won't imagine balancing dinner, heating water, and keeping children safe all in this small space. Yet medieval inhabitants mastered it daily. Scholars still argue whether these setups were regionally standardized or unique to each household, but they showcase ingenuity born of necessity. The hearth also acts as a social nucleus. Oddly, people gather here not just for warmth, but to share stories, teach skills, and observe communal rituals. You probably won't consider a fire as a hub of communication in modern terms, but here conversation, learning, and vigilance revolve around it. Scholars still debate the extent to which hearth-centered gatherings influenced culture, but it's clear that the fire structures rhythm and intimacy within the home. You notice subtle safety measures, stones surrounding the flames, raised platforms to prevent accidental burns, and occasionally a simple iron grate. Oddly, these precautions reveal a keen awareness of risk. Even in a rudimentary environment, you probably won't find it comforting to imagine sparks flying on straw floors. Yet families developed practical habits to mitigate hazards while maximizing utility. Scholars still argue whether these precautions were consciously taught or instinctively learned, but they're effective nonetheless. Oddly, the hearth's heat interacts with the home in multiple ways. Smoke laid and beams dry walls, warm floors, and even assist in low-level pest control. You probably won't think of fire as a multitasking tool, yet its effects ripple through temperature regulation, sanitation, and even domestic planning. Scholars still debate how intentionally these secondary benefits were harnessed, but life in the medieval home relied on them implicitly. Lighting is another hidden function. Even minimal flames illuminate cooking areas, sleeping spaces, and working corners. Oddly, the flicker of light also serves psychological purposes. It's soothing, hypnotic, and provides a gentle focus point amidst dim interiors. You probably won't equate flame with mental comfort, but centuries of human experience prove otherwise. Scholars still argue whether people recognized this consciously, but they undoubtedly felt the calming influence of fire. Food preservation and preparation intertwine here as well. Oddly, smoke from the hearth doubles as a method to cure meats or dry herbs, extending their usability. You probably won't realize the subtle alchemy at work. Yet fire, smoke, and heat are central to sustenance. Scholars still debate whether this was an intentional practice of resource management or a happy coincidence, but the results speak for themselves. Finally, as you settle near the hearth, feeling warmth seep into your bones and watching shadows stretch lazily across the room, you sense the intricate balance of medieval life. You probably won't survive a night without appreciating the hearth's central role. Yet it's a quiet teacher showing how fire shapes comfort, safety, social bonds, and survival. Oddly, every crackle, flicker, and wisp of smoke is a small reminder that life in these homes is an ongoing negotiation between human ingenuity and environmental challenge. Your attention drifts to the storage areas, tucked into corners beneath stairs, or suspended from beams. You probably won't give them much thought at first glance, but in a medieval home, storage is survival. Oddly, everything has a designated spot. Often improvised baskets hang from hooks. Clay jars line shelves, and cloth sacks contain grains, legumes, or dried herbs. Scholars still debate whether these systems were consciously designed for efficiency or evolved organically, but either way, they reveal a keen understanding of spatial optimization. Food storage is particularly fascinating. Oddly, items are often unlayered with straw, sand, or ashes to prevent spoilage and deter pests. You probably won't imagine using dirt and straw as natural preservatives. Yet these methods prolonged edibles in the absence of refrigeration. Scholars still argue whether medieval households had precise knowledge of preservation science or relied on trial and error. But their practices kept families alive through harsh seasons. Suspended storage is also common. Oddly, hanging items like cured meats, smoked fish, or bundles of herbs keeps them away from curious animals, while allowing airflow to reduce rot. You probably won't think it's convenient to reach up for food, yet practicality wins over comfort in these homes. Scholars still debate how universally this method was applied, but evidence suggests it was widespread and remarkably effective. You notice tools are often stored alongside food. Oddly, a single shelf might contain knives, spoons, and agricultural implements, blurring the line between kitchen and workshop. You probably won't consider this hygienic by modern standards, yet functionality was prioritized over cleanliness. Scholars still argue whether such proximity increased risk of disease or simply represented efficient use of scarce resources. But the combined system demonstrates adaptability. Shelving is rudimentary but clever. Oddly, beams, ropes, and wooden planks create temporary platforms and niches. You probably won't imagine this as elegant, yet it maximizes vertical space in cramped interiors. Scholars still debate whether these solutions were consciously engineered or evolved through repeated necessity, but they exemplify the medieval knack for resourceful construction. Oddly, storage also serves social and symbolic purposes. Precious items, family heirlooms, or tools of status are often elevated or hidden in special nooks. You probably won't notice these subtleties immediately, yet their placement signals hierarchy, ownership, and protection. Scholars still argue how intentional these arrangements were, but they reflect an awareness of both material and social order. Ventilation is critical here as well. Oddly, hanging herbs or open sacks allow airflow that prevents spoilage. You probably won't think much about moving air as a preservation method, yet it is central to food security. Scholars still debate whether this principle was consciously applied or simply discovered through experience, but its impact on daily survival is clear. You notice that some containers are marked or coated with scratches, symbols, or tied knots. Oddly, this system allows for identification without written language, guiding tasks, inventory, and even family chores. You probably won't find it intuitive immediately, yet it's an early example of organizational ingenuity. Scholars still argue whether such codes were standardized or unique to each household, but the practice demonstrates adaptation and subtle communication within the domestic sphere. Finally, as you examine the variety of storage solutions hanging, hidden, layered, and ventilated, you realize that medieval homes are masters of improvisation. You probably won't survive long without understanding the logic behind every basket, hook, and jar, yet in their clever placement lies centuries of practical wisdom. Oddly, the art of storage here reveals more about resilience, ingenuity, and domestic life than the most polished modern home ever could. Your gaze drifts toward the floors, and it's immediately obvious they are far from uniform. Dirt, straw, or roughly hewn planks dominate, creating an uneven surface that responds to every step. You probably won't appreciate it at first, but the floor is as functional as any other part of the home, shaping movement, hygiene, and even comfort. Oddly, families often unlayered straw or rushes to cushion feet, insulate against cold, and absorb moisture. Scholars still argue whether this practice was primarily hygienic, practical, or traditional, but it demonstrates a subtle understanding of material properties. The dirt floors have their own ecosystem. Oddly, insects, small rodents. An occasional plant growth are tolerated or managed through routine cleaning and vigilance. You probably won't enjoy coexisting with such creatures. Yet for medieval inhabitants, this was normal life and ongoing negotiation with nature. Scholars still debate how much of this exposure affected health or immune development. But it's undeniable that humans adapted to these conditions. Raised planks or simple wooden boards are often used in key areas near the hearth, in sleeping zones or under food storage. Oddly, this creates microclimates within the home, insulating against cold or dampness and directing movement. You probably won't consider it comfortable by modern standards. Yet it's ingenious in its simplicity. Scholars still argue whether these designs were planned or emerged through trial and error, but they reveal the subtle intelligence of daily life. You notice the straw or rushes lining the floor are changed periodically, layered over older, compressed material. Oddly, this creates both warmth and cleanliness, absorbing spills and odors. You probably won't want to lie directly on it, but for centuries, this was a standard method to maintain a livable environment. Scholars still debate how often this was done, but the layered system clearly improves quality of life. The floor also plays a role in social interaction. Oddly, areas closer to the hearth or main entrance are more trafficked, while corners and raised sections provide private spaces or sleeping zones. You probably won't recognize it immediately, but the arrangement of floor materials subtly directs daily patterns and domestic flow. Scholars still argue whether this was consciously organized or simply a product of habit, but the effect is clear. Floors are as much about structure as they are about surface. Oddly, noise interacts with the flooring. Wooden planks creak, straw muffles footsteps, and dirt surfaces create distinct sounds when walked upon. You probably won't notice it consciously, but this auditory feedback helps inhabitants sense movement, presence, or intrusion. Scholars still debate how intentional this acoustic awareness was, yet it undeniably shaped domestic vigilance and safety. Maintenance is constant. Oddly, sweeping, layering, and replacing sections of floor are recurring tasks that define daily routines. You probably won't imagine this is labor-intensive, yet it is essential for hygiene, comfort, and organization. Scholars still argue whether families developed schedules for such upkeep or simply responded to visible dirt and smell. But either approach highlights the ongoing labor required to keep a home functional. Finally, as you step back and survey the floors, you realize they are more than mere surfaces. They are living, breathing components of domestic life. You probably won't survive without understanding their nuances, yet centuries of adaptation have transformed them into multifunctional spaces, insulating, guiding, regulating, and protecting. Oddly, these humble surfaces reveal more about daily survival, ingenuity, and the rhythms of medieval life than any polished modern floor ever could. Finally, your eyes wander to the door, the humble portal that separates the intimate chaos of the home from the unpredictable world outside. You probably won't think much of it at first, yet this barrier is a linchpin of survival, comfort, and even social signaling. Oddly, doors are rarely just wooden planks. They are crafted from available timber, reinforced with iron straps, and sometimes fitted with rudimentary locks or bars. Scholars still argue whether security was the primary concern or if insulation from wide and rain dominated design choices. But either way, the door embodies both function and adaptation. You notice the hinges are thick, rough-hewn, and often squeaky. Oddly, the sound of the door moving serves as an unintentional alarm. A creak announces visitors, intruders, or even livestock wandering too close. You probably won't find the noise charming, yet for medieval inhabitants, it's a subtle security measure built into daily life. Scholars still debate whether this auditory cue was exploited intentionally or simply observed, but its practical effect is undeniable. Peering through the gap beneath the door, you see the floor continues outside in dirt or cobblestone, a subtle reminder that the home's warmth is fragile. Oddly, this thin threshold is both a barrier and a bridge it keeps out wine, mud, and stray animals, but allows communication, transactions, and observation. You probably won't appreciate how critical this balance is until you imagine life without it. Scholars still argue whether thresholds were ritualized spaces with symbolic meaning or purely functional, but either interpretation enriches our understanding of domestic life. The door also influences light and air. Oddly, small cracks let in slivers of sunlight, moonlight, or drafts, subtly shaping interior climate and mood. You probably won't notice it consciously, but these tiny openings guide activity, alerting people to approaching storms, marking the passage of day, or simply hinting at the world beyond. Scholars still debate how consciously medieval people used these cues, but it's clear that such design elements were intertwined with daily life. The threshold itself often bears signs of wear, smooth wood from countless footsteps, nicks from moving furniture, or scorch marks. Oddly, these marks act as a silent record of family activity, community traffic, and the passage of time. You probably won't consider a worn threshold historically significant. Yet every groove tells a story of life lived, adapted, and negotiated. Scholars still argue how much meaning people assign to these physical traces, but their presence is a tactile reminder of continuity. Locking mechanisms, when present, are rudimentary yet effective. Oddly, even simple wooden bars or iron staples dramatically alter the sense of security within the home. You probably won't survive long without appreciating their importance. Yet they reflect a medieval understanding of safety within material limits. Scholars still debate whether locks were primarily practical or symbolic of status, but either way, they serve as a critical interface between inside and outside life. Oddly, the door is also a stage for social interaction. Neighbors, traders, and visitors exchange greetings, news, and goods at its threshold, blending domestic privacy with communal engagement. You probably won't survive long in isolation without using this portal wisely. Yet it shows the intricate balance between openness and protection that defines medieval living. Scholars still argue how consciously these social cues influenced design, but it's evident that doors mediated relationships as much as they did airflow or light. Finally, as you step back and consider the door alongside walls, floors, hearth, and roof, you realize that every element of the home is a delicate negotiation between survival, comfort, and social life. You probably won't imagine enduring these conditions without constant observation and adaptation. Yet centuries of human ingenuity have transformed raw materials into a functional sanctuary. Oddly, the door, seemingly simple, oft and overlooked, embodies the same ingenuity, resilience, and quiet complexity that define the medieval home. It's both a boundary and invitation, a modest guardian that quietly tells the story of life inside and out. You lean back, feeling the day's tension slowly melt away. The hearth flickers in your mind, casting shadows that stretch lazily across the walls, while the floor beneath your imagined feet feels steady yet alive, imbued with centuries of care and adaptation. Outside, the wind brushes faintly against the door, teasing the edges of a home that has withstood storms, cold nights, and curious passers-by. Oddly, these small details, the smell of straw, the texture of rough-hewn beams, the faint creak of the door, combine into a comforting rhythm, a soft lullaby from the past. Your senses relax further as you imagine the interplay of light, shadow, and warmth. Moonlight drifts through narrow windows, brushing the edges of walls and hearth, illuminating patterns that only the careful eye would notice. Oddly, this dim glow feels protective rather than limiting, a quiet reminder that even minimal light can guide, soothe, and comfort. The faint rustle of straw and distant animal sounds mingle with your breathing, forming a gentle ambient hum that encourages stillness. Think of the layers of human ingenuity that shaped every corner of the hearth's warmth. The straw-lined floors, the carefully maintained roof, and even the small imperfections of walls and doors. Oddly, these imperfections are part of the charm. They remind you that life is resilient, adaptive, and quietly persistent. Let the tactile, visual, and olfactory details of this medieval space wash over you, coaxing your mind into slow, calm reflection. Now, dim the lights in your own room. Maybe turn on a fan or leave the window slightly open. Let the rhythm of the past lull you towards serenity. You've wandered through centuries of human creativity, discomfort, and adaptation. Oddly, and embracing these small, lived experiences, your own breathing slows and a soft sense of peace settles in. Sweet dreams.